So let's start off with our panel. Sarah Savage. So Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Many thanks, Mel. So yeah, my name is Sarah Savage. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at TransferMate. With over 25 years in the banking and payments industry, I'm currently responsible for the development and execution of the global go-to-market strategy for TransferMate.
Thank you. And Kelly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Kelly Williams. I'm a strategic sales manager with TransferMate. I've been with the company for over 5 years. I lead a team of over 20 relationship managers, and we're responsible for driving customer excellence and managing client relationships.
Thanks, Kelly. And Rory?
Yeah, hi all. Rory Keller, CEO of Amidas. So coming at this from the global payroll perspective, and hopefully can help and give some guidance and advice and war stories on how we marry the kind of technology of delivering the global payroll and through to all the way to the end of delivering the payments into the global jurisdiction.
Thanks, Rory. And we've got Rick all the way over in the States. Hi, Rick. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. Rick Hamill with Elements Global Services, CEO. 10 years in the EOR, PEO space. Here really talking about alternative employment and supporting the ability to span and process payments around the world.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm just going to pass this over to Sarah, who will give you a bit of a background of what today's webinar is about.
Many thanks indeed, Mel. So as you can see, we've lined up a fantastic panel of experts to discuss how to de-risk international payments, specifically addressing some of the key challenges such as local restrictions or legislations, some challenging infrastructures, and the time sensitivity around payroll payments, and also the manual processes that are often involved. In addition, we'll also be sharing some insight to alternative solutions that are available, which I know the audience listening here today will find interesting. So with that, Mel, I'll pass the reins back to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so kicking off the discussion, let's touch on one of the key challenges in international payments, local restrictions and the challenges posed by exotic currencies. So, okay, so let's go over to our first question with Sarah. So starting off with you, firstly, what are the key payroll considerations when employing staff in new or challenging markets?
Yeah, Mel, so one thing that's clear in the global payroll space is that the model of a head office payroll team that it may have in place for the EU cannot be replicated locally in other markets. And by that, I mean processing salaries globally can be a challenge, especially if you don't have revenue generating entities in market. You may not have the ability to house your own local personnel or expertise. You also may not have your own banking accounts or infrastructure. And it's likely that you'll need to invest heavily to put the right arrangements in place to support payroll of your staff. You need to consider the current processes, be aware of local or regional nuances that may be quite different to your core or existing markets. These include timelines for settlement, bank holidays or working days, how to manage errors such as missing or delayed payments. Companies with multiple entities and multiple employees around the globe find it easier to navigate these complexities or regional nuances by leveraging partners who have experience in these networks, in these markets, and have the necessary infrastructure already in place to simplify the process of paying their staff, irrespective of where they're based.
Okay, thanks then, Sarah. So Rick, this is a question for you. When processing payments, what do I need to take into account when understanding the difference between major, minor, and exotic currency statuses?
That's a great question. I think the one thing that you want to look at is timelines. Major currencies are very easy to get out and transfer to different countries. Minor have some fluctuation issues and some heavier restrictions within different countries, but your exotics are the ones that take a little bit longer. There particular countries have higher restrictions in how that money comes into the country. For example, using Brazil or even looking at Argentina, these particular countries have high regulations on how that money is actually coming to the particular beneficiary in country. So looking at how the beneficiary name is put in place, making sure you have the bank account information and explanation of why the funds are coming in, really are determined by that major, minor, exotic status. office. It's really simplistic from a major perspective. So looking at USD or euros or pounds and how that fluctuates and how you can transfer that easily between banking institutions. But what we find typically where we're having, where companies typically have a little bit tougher time is how you define an exotic currency, how do you get it into country, and how do you ensure that the banking institution is not going to hold that. So really understanding the differences between the currencies and how to make sure you're pushing that information over to the bank and then making sure that you're documenting that information accordingly is really important. So your exotics are always going to be a little bit harder, so always giving a little bit more time to make sure those payments go out a little bit earlier. What we do here at Elements, we typically take, either we're 2 to 3 extra days within our timelines to make sure we're pushing them through, and we give those banking institutes a lot more information to ensure those payments go out accordingly. So it's just really making sure the documentation and making sure timelines are put in place to ensure on-time payments.
So you be prepared so you didn't get caught out.
Absolutely. It's very interesting that with exotic currencies, some of the rules and regulations change on a monthly basis. And sometimes you just have to be overly prepared to ensure that those payments aren't delayed, especially when you're talking about payroll.
Okay. So what do you recommend when processing payments into countries where currencies are classified as exotic?
So one thing what we've seen and what we've been really successful in is partnering with the institute that you're looking to send the funds to, working with a beneficiary to gather all the necessary information. So their full name, their date of birth, all the information you can to ensure that when you're sending those funds into country, that the banks don't have any concerns of what this money is for. As you already know, in some cases that sending money into certain countries, there's tax implications, or governments want to ensure that employees or not employees, just their citizens are paying their taxes. So if you're doing an expense reimbursement, for example, you want to make sure that you're sending all the supporting documentation with that and indicating what this is so that the employee or your beneficiary is not taxed as if it's actual income.
So we have actually had a question in, and somebody's asked whether or not there's a list of requirements by country that they can access. Is that something that is available?
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is actually reach out to the banking institution that you're sending the funds to. I think it's really important because every bank operates a little bit differently. So when you're looking at banks that operate more in exotic currencies, they're going to be a little bit different. So the biggest thing is reaching out to them and asking what information you need to make sure this payment goes out correctly.
Thanks, Rick. Rory, so is there, are there any countries, regions where payments are more difficult to provide accurately and timely? Are there locations where you just can't pay into?
Yeah, there certainly is. Like the kind of following on from the Q&A question, and there's multiple considerations that you need to take into account when it's a payroll payment. So there's local restrictions around the actual ability to pay into that country, but there's also ancillary considerations that need to be taken into account around the legislation around what's allowed to be done from a payroll perspective. So, there's certainly countries where you can pay into, but paying in for payroll payments, as Rick mentioned, can fall under a different legislatum. So you need to take all of those different data points and consider what's the total view when you're thinking of global payments. So it's really important from a payroll and payments platform perspective that those are intertwined, and there's an understanding as to how to do that. There's countries specifically heavily in LATAM where where payments to employees but also to tax authorities need to be generated from in country, and in some circumstances generated from the employer's bank account itself. So you really need to look at all of the different aspects and look at it holistically as to how is your organization set up structurally, and where is your main entity? Is there an entity in country? Is there a bank account in country? And then look at the method as to which you're going to pay in. As Rick mentioned, the differences between the major, minor, and exotic countries. The biggest challenge we would see in global payroll around minors, to a certain extent, but specifically to the exotics, is the predictability of time and flight. So in terms of those challenges, you really need to look at all of the different angles when you're paying into that country. So
having a good relationship with your payroll provider or your payments provider is essential when you're dealing with global payroll.
Yeah, it's really important that the life cycle of the payroll is understood, and in some organizations the payments will sit within finance or treasury, and those functions may be paying into jurisdictions for AP or AR, but the legislation around paying for payroll is different. So you need to actually be talking and communicating to one another as to what, as Rick mentioned, what the source of funds actually is for.
I think that's when COVID happened, that was one of the issues. So obviously people were stressing about actually the legislation changes, and then all of a sudden it was like, how do we pay people, because things were changing within different countries.
Yeah, like there's a myriad of complexities to it. Like we would love the world to be a little bit more simple and for everyone to agree on how it works, and then the banking infrastructure can be even worse. So, there's legislation in certain jurisdictions where, a payment can be made abroad for the employees, but it can't be for the tax authorities. So now you're splitting payments. So compliance is a key part of that. So you really need to look at how have you set up your payroll globally? Is it a central global, or is it a local payroll? Is it a local payroll model? And how you set up the payments around that is really going to depend on how you set up your payroll model.
Thanks, Rory. So let's go on to our next questions. Okay, while local legislations and currencies pose a significant challenge, so too does banking networks and tax authorities, in addition to keeping up to date with global challenges. So let's start off with a question to Rick. We've briefly discussed what is classified as an exotic currency, but how does employment laws and in-country regulation determine how you pay employees from foreign and local bank accounts?
So I think looking at the exotic currency could be a great starting point here. Exotic currencies have a lot of fluctuation, which is part of the reason why their status is exotic. And a number of employees we've seen, especially with government contractors or companies who are looking to hire expats or foreign nationals in different markets, we've seen that in some cases they want to be paid in their local currencies because they do not want to be subject to the fluctuation with exotic currencies. So for example, using Nigeria, where a number of years ago, the currency was changing so much the government had to come in to regulate it. And the rules and regulations in Nigeria indicate that an employee must be paid in local currency if they're working in Nigeria. Well, if you take that and you put a expat into that country, or someone that's used to being paid in U.S. dollars, maybe because their bills are in U.S. dollars, or they're what they're used to issuing out for payments, and when there's a lot of fluctuation with that, they're not comfortable with the local currency. Well, you sometimes have a conflict between local what the rules and regulations are from an employment perspective and what the employee thinks is best for them and what they need in that country. And so it's really important that employers really understand the rules and regulations of that country, understand what can and cannot be done. Where we mentioned earlier, maybe you can pay a net payroll to the employee based on fluctuations, but then their taxes still have to be calculated in local currency. So really understanding the rules and regulations. In some cases, working with an HR provider or an EOR provider, we can help with those type of things and indicate what you can and cannot do. But it really can impact not just from a fluctuation in currency, but also how you're paying taxes, making sure employees are paying the right amount of tax. If you're issuing in US dollars and you calculated taxes 10 days prior to that, the fluctuation may have gone up and the employee actually earned more income. So you have to make sure that you have a good balance there in how you are processing payroll. In some cases, you do true-ups of the month after or every quarter, but it's really making sure that you comply with the local rules and regulations, because from an audit perspective, if you do pay an employee in a local currency, not a local currency, in a USD or a Euro currency, and that employee actually earned more income based on the local currency conversion, the employee and the employer are still subject to taxes and can be subject to penalties if it's not done correctly. So it's really important to understand those rules and regulations.
Yeah, some of our GPA members have actually mentioned that that's happened, that they've ended up paying the staff more because of the conversions.
Happy staff.
Yeah, happy staff.
But we do want to make sure that from a balancing perspective, because we do know governments want to make sure that they receive the proper amount of taxes. And so how you make sure you balance that out, and one month it may be higher, one month it may be lower, but if it regulates and the employee, the government does an audit on the employee's bank account and they say that you short pay taxes by a certain amount of money, there's some penalties that can come both to the employer and the employee.
So initially happy employees, but maybe not in the end. Okay. So Sarah, how does an EU payroll team keep up to date, informed and compliant with the multiple geographical locations?
Yeah, so Mel, look, it's tough. It's tough. There's so many caveats per region or locally. So unless companies have a team on the ground or have invested into a fully functioning legal entity, they may not be aware of certain key or payroll impacting entities issues like bank holidays, like the time it takes to get payroll payments processed. Rick touched on that, as did Rory just a moment ago, but also the regulations which Rick just covered there. And there may be some other restrictions that apply, in particular the exotic markets. And I know we have a question from the audience there. Maybe Rick and Rory can outline the exact list of those countries which are classified as exotic currencies as well. So an EU payroll team who has multiple employees across different locations historically needed to have that team, and as I say, the IT infrastructure in place to manage the different or regional nuances, the local bank accounts, local law reviews potentially, and they have to comply with the different payment networks as well. So if you take APAC as an example, every 200 kilometers, you've got a different language, a different currency, and potentially a different payment network as well. So it's a challenge for all companies of all sizes across all markets. So the best way that an EU payroll team can ensure that they are informed, compliant, and able to support the changing or the complex legislation is to work with an existing partner, one with a relevant footprint and a global payment processing capability, along with market-leading infrastructure designed to simplify the global payroll components by removing the requirement for extensive expertise locally and providing a consistent positive experience for both the payroll team, but also the employees as well.
Thanks, Sarah. So, Rick, we've sort of touched on this. How does income tax and VAT respectively affect employees when making payments internationally?
So I think that, and I'll use an example for Turkey. Anytime you are issuing payments into Turkey, there's a VAT requirement. Same thing with China as well. And so those governments are deducting those VAT taxes directly before those payments actually hit or are credited to those bank accounts. And so it's really understanding how you justify what those payments are. From an employer perspective, I can use Elements as an example. When we're funding our Turkish accounts to support our EOR, we still have to pay a VAT. The government is telling us, you're sending money into this country, even if it's for payroll, you have to pay that tax. Well, now, if you're sending direct payments to employees, that same methodology still applies. So when you're sending a direct payment to the employee, this is their payroll, they're still subject to VAT. And so you have to be very careful on how you're documenting that. Sometimes having a local bank account will support that, but again, from an employer perspective, you're still paying that VAT. Using a party like TransferMate or an EOR like Elements, you have the ability to kind of mitigate some of those risks, and not because of our local bank accounts support, but there's a lot of rules and regulations that you have to be careful with. You just not like you do in the EU or in the US, you just can't issue a payment. In some cases, a number of countries will tax that immediately when that payment is received by the bank before it credits the beneficiary.
Thanks. The question that we had, sorry, it was in chat, is what exactly are exotic currencies? Could you explain that, Rick?
Sure. So an exotic currency is really determined based on the fluctuation within the currency compared to either the pound, the euro, or the dollar. From a U.S. perspective, we would compare it against the dollar, and it's really how volatile that currency is. So when you're looking at Latin American currencies, a lot of African currencies, there's a lot of volatility there, and so the currency can change from one day to the next dramatically, and so they have to classify it as exotic because it's hard to maintain and keep those currencies because of the volatility of those currencies.
Thanks, Rick. Okay, so we've discussed some of the external challenges, but let's have a look at the internal ones. Rory, this question's for you. Are there a number of settlement methods available for international payroll? In your experience, what is the most efficient and why?
Yeah, I'll take this from a payroll angle, and like a lot of payroll professionals on the line here. So like in terms of the payroll process, so syncing the payment, which is one of the most important parts in the payroll process, ensuring that the employees get paid on time and accurately. What we try to do is to give time back in the payroll cycle. So the most efficient way is around a direct debit or a reverse wire, where the payroll platform is integrated with the customer bank account. So instead of sending funding requests, which need automated or which need sign off or administrative sign off within organizations, where the payroll process and ultimately the net pay file is integrated with the customer's bank account directly, where we can we can automatically pull funds at the same time as approving the payroll cycle. It is the most efficient way, because the slowest part of the payroll cycle in some circumstances can be actually the sending of the funds. So if your payroll engine, if your payroll partner or platform or engine is integrated both with the customer and your payments partner, you can remove all of the administrative time being spent on getting payments approved, etc.
Okay. Thanks, Rory. So, Rick, I can imagine there are many lessons that you have learned, and I bet you've got some interesting stories. What have you learned transferring international payments? What have you learned on that?
Oh, Mel, how much time do we have?
We feel like the whole rest of this webinar with your stories.
Absolutely. There's a lot of lessons learned. I think if you just sum it up, the best ones are understanding the timelines to make sure currencies get out on time. I think that's really important. Understanding what information each country is going to need to ensure those payments are received, but also making sure that you really know how you're processing these payments. We talked a lot about getting the payments into country, but how do you make sure you get those payments out of the country? There's a lot of rules and regulations coming from the US or the EU and how money's transferred into certain countries and certain areas. And so making sure you understand really, what are you sending and how you're sending it, so that when it has to leave your home country, that's really important, because that can also hold up a transfer even before it goes out to another country. So just really making sure you're documenting your processes and your procedures, working with your banking institution to understand what they need to make sure that payment gets out on time, and then working with the beneficiary or the employee to ensure that you have all the proper documentation to ensure those payments are received on time. I think it's just it's a process, just making sure that you dot all your I's and cross all your T's.
And does it involve, do you think, a lot of communication, networking with your providers, banking, just to make sure everything's done on time?
Absolutely. I think it's important working with a company that really understands global payments. It's not as, and again, I think sometimes we get stuck in what we know, what we do in our home countries and how we actually issue those payments. And we realize that we're sending to other countries and they have different rules, they have different cultures and different expectations. And so really working with a partner who really understands that, if it's from a payment transfer or an FX provider like TransferMate, if it's a payroll provider like Amidas, or if it's an EOR provider like Elements, really making sure that they understand how they can support your business and ensure that there's no delays. I think it's really important.
I don't know if Rory, you haven't had anything to add to that at all?
Yeah, a bit like Rick. I'm sure there's more lessons to learn, but I've seen a lot of it. I think like the main one is, I would say, is like establishing a payment framework that interacts with how you run your payroll operation. So, if you are local to local payroll, if that's how you have structured your payroll departments, where you do it in the individual entity, you should have a payments system that matches that. If you've got a global payroll or a regional payroll methodology, your payment provider and the way you interact with the payment provider should marry those two. What I see is, both from a global payroll perspective and the payments perspective, the knock-on effect is where organizations try to mix those two, where we want a local payment solution to a global payroll model, or vice versa. And you're thinking about, people think about it in what their home country is, but the impact in another jurisdiction is so different. And as I said earlier on, the infrastructure that is still at play in the large majority of payments, if you go down the old banking route, is still not up to date with how modern technology systems work. So you really need to understand, the payroll process is ultimately the data point that powers the payment process. So you've got to get the payroll process aligned to that.
And actually, Mel, just on that topic, I'm really interested to understand from Rick and from Rory. We've discussed a little bit about how technology and partners can help simplify global payroll. However, I'm really interested to learn and capture a little bit more insight from the guys as to how the cultural evolution is impacting digital payments. How are you finding that, Rick?
So I think that's a great question. I think that we sometimes have to forget that. So if you understand some of the historical issues that countries had with banking, like Argentina or Mexico over the last decade or so, there are some cultural people in the culture who don't trust banks, and so how do we ensure that they get paid? And so we've had to do, from an elements perspective, we've had to think outside the box. We have to make sure that when we're processing payments, for that one employee who says they don't have a bank account, but they're a star employee for the client, how do you ensure that that payment comes through? That's looking at, Bitcoin, or if it's a Western Union type transfer, or if it's a cash transfer. We've been have to think outside the box to support that. But there are a lot of cultural nuances that there are countries that, for example, in Argentina, I think it was a little over 10 years ago, where the banks froze, and then they seized all the assets and many bank accounts, and then the currency dropped dramatically and actually changed from a major currency to an exotic currency overnight. And for a lot of citizens, for quite some time, they did not trust the banking institutions in Argentina. They did not want to put their money, or did not want to receive their money there. So understanding that when you're doing business in those countries, and finding alternative solutions really does help ease that pain before you even get started. When you're looking at countries like Mexico, similar situation happened, which is why their currency is no longer a major currency as well. But how do you work with them and look at different ways of transferring? Millennials, how many millennials, if you raise your hand, when was the first time you opened a bank account? When you were in your teens or your early 20s? You have to think about how you're going to get payments to them. And so there are different solutions out there, and different alternative solutions that employees are looking for and can bring to employers. Listen to the employees and seeing if you can bring that to your provider, and see how we can support that process. I think it's really important.
No, that's great. And how about yourself, Rory? Anything to add there?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. It's a really interesting dynamic as to how modern employees view, and we see it from a payroll perspective as to, our underlying belief is that the pay slip is going to change over the coming years, where that needs to become a lot more dynamic, where younger generations, and I'm making myself feel very old here, but use multiple different pay points. You will have your standard institutions where your mortgage or your rent comes out of, but a lot of people will then have other different methods, be it Revolut, for example, where they would use that as their kind of social fund, for want of a better term. So, we're looking at creating a dynamic pay slip that gives the employee the ultimate control, because ultimately it's their money, and how to point that. So instead of it becoming a very static process where at the end of the month your net pay goes from your pay slip into your bank account, that may be where the employee has control as to where funds are directed, be it they're going on holiday, so they want to take it directly through a platform where they want it in that currency in their Revolut account, for example. So, that's really going to change. As Rick mentioned, there's a lot of people now, there are a lot of younger generations whose first account is something like Revolut. So that's how they live their lives. I think payroll really needs to be to the fore of that, because the payroll element of that is the biggest source of funds in the global population. So how that changes, it's really important that payroll and payments keep up with that.
Rory, if I can jump in on that as well, I think that a trend that we've started to see as well is prepaid cards. That's the easiest way that a lot of employees are looking to take their cash. And the first time you hear that, you're like, what do you mean you don't have a bank account? This is called direct deposit. So being very flexible and understanding those approaches, and then just because of some of the historical nuances that have happened in those countries, even if it's going to a prepaid debit card, someone feels a little bit more secure because they're managing that versus going to a large bank. So I second that, as we have to continue to be revolutionary.
Yeah, absolutely. And the real-time pay is something that's really going to explode, I think, over the next 2 to 3 years, where, as opposed to having a finite pay date at the end of a cycle, people are going to want to withdraw their money as they see fit on any day of the week, especially the kind of transient workforce, the gig economy workforce, where they almost create a wallet of their own funds and they want to control that. So that's going to have a challenge in payroll and how you maintain live calculations. But, I think it's a good challenge for the payroll industry and the payments industry to be able to deliver that.
And the impacts on legislation, because I know we've been talking about it within the UK, and there are difficulties with that, but obviously that is the future, I think, isn't it? That's the way forward.
Absolutely.
Okay, so of all payments, payroll is surely the most sensitive of them all. In international payroll, there are often challenges with missing and or delayed payments. So Rory, what time impact do foreign payments have on the payroll cycle? Are there any methods to save time?
Yeah, there certainly is, and like, it's not to hark back, but it's, how well have you planned your global payroll strategy against your global payment strategy for payroll, and how they intertwine is critical in terms of how you save time, and then in choosing the correct payments partner that can pay as locally as possible, if that makes sense. Because if you have a global or a regional payment or a payroll where you consolidate the payment through a single source, you're only as quick as the slowest country. So as we mentioned earlier on, some of that can take 4 to 5 days if it's exotics in terms of predictability to land. So that means your whole payroll cycle is pushed back. So if you can marry technology into a payments partner that can deliver on the ground as locally as possible at the end, you save huge amounts of time in the process. Like, if a standard payroll process globally is kind of 6 to 8 days cut off, you can save yourself 25, 30% of that pay cycle purely by reducing the payments piece. So if you can have an integrated solution where your settlement of funds, your approval of the gross to net, and your distribution on the ground are all synced, there's a huge amount of time that could be saved in the cycle.
That's a lot of time.
Yeah.
So are there any methods, I was going to say, are there any methods to save time? I think you've answered that question, haven't you? You've done it done for me.
Yeah, there is. Like, there's huge, like, it is all about technology. Technology in payroll and payments is what's going to save you the most time. If you can eliminate the most amount of manual and administrative steps in the process, you are certainly going to save time. If you can avoid the archaic Swift network in banking, you will definitely save your time. And when you're coming to the last question, you're going to save yourself a lot of hassle.
Yeah. Okay. So do you have any advice on managing escalations when there are payroll errors? Because obviously payment errors do happen. Sorry, not payroll. Payment errors do happen. What's your advice on that?
Yeah, I'd love to say payroll errors don't happen, but I'd be lying. But payment errors do happen. And I think the most frustrating thing about payment errors is it's incredibly hard to find out where the error happened. I think in payroll errors, it's much more transparent. You're in the system, you can see the error and you can fix it very quickly. In payment areas, when payment errors, it can go through, especially exotic and minor currencies, where it's going through a raft of different banks or processes to get to land in country. The errors can range from the wrong amount landed because there's different fees taken along the way, or it's delayed, or in some scenarios it's just lost. My advice would be, and it's a really difficult thing to say because it's a very emotional topic when someone's payroll goes wrong, but is to try and take the emotion out of it. And payment errors do happen. It's part of the process. Unfortunately, by planning and utilizing the right partners and technology, you can minimize them. But taking the emotion out and being able to crisis manage the situation and not jumping to sending the payment again. A lot of the natural reaction is to send the payment to the employee again down the same channel. If there is an issue with that channel, sending it down that channel is not going to work. You really need to identify what the problem is. And if you have technology, if you have a payroll platform and a payments partner where you can have as much of the information to hand, where you have tracking numbers, reference numbers, swift confirmations as to on the payment, the quicker you can access that, the better chance you have of solving it correctly. But in managing escalations, it's really to be close to the payroll and payments partner, and because the employee and the employer, rightly so, are going to be, it's going to be quite a difficult period when someone hasn't got paid, and people are going to have personal stresses, like a lot of people set their mortgages, etc., and rents around their pay date, and when that goes wrong, it can cause huge amount of stress. So it's being really, really close, but trying to take the emotion out of it to get the problem solved as quickly. And my advice was, in the first instance, try to solve it in a different way than the original payment.
Thanks, Rory. Does anybody else have anything to add at all?
Oh, Rory, exactly. I'm going to second everything Rory said as well. I think it's how do you make sure you understand your payroll calendar, make sure you understand your timelines, and make sure you're proactively pushing. One thing that I've seen from that we've put in place, has been really maybe doing it, processing payments a little bit earlier and having a value date of 2 or 3 days earlier. so that if there's any issues, we can catch that right away, so that the employees can have that. We have that 2 or 3 days that we can try to resolve that on behalf of the employee. It's very interesting. In some cases, the mistake has been there's a missing an accent over a letter. And so if you think about it from a US perspective and a keyboard, there's not an accent. You can't create an accent on your keyboard when you're typing in, or sometimes your banking institute won't allow you to do that. So in some cases, once you issue those payments, you have to then reach out to the beneficiary bank, indicate that this is your SWIFT information, and then so that there's the payment can go through. So I think it's just understanding the nuances, being proactive as much as possible, and making sure that you follow your deadlines. And sometimes we don't want to follow those deadlines, but I think it's very important to do so to avoid any of these time delays as well.
That feels so bizarre in 2020. Just some, smallest bit of information like that could cause so much.
Yeah, I think to add to Rick's point, I don't know, Rick, be interested to hear your experience on this, but the majority of the payment errors that we occur is the first time that it goes down the rail. So the first time you would see it, it's around, new joiners to organizations, or the first time setup of a company. So if your payroll platform is integrated with your payments partner like TransferMate, where you can do all that pre-validation, go through the PEPs and sanctions list, it's generally the first time it goes down that something goes wrong. Because payroll is so repetitive, once there's a flow and a fluidity to it, by and large, you would get, a very consistent and accurate delivery. So it's really about investing the time on the joiners or the setup of the original pay file that I would really be conscious that people spend time on. Run the penny tests, run the PEPs and sanctions list for every new person. Do it well in advance of the payroll process if possible.
We've had another question in. How does PDS2 impact this topic? Don't know if anybody can answer that one. No? Okay. We'll come back to you on that question. Okay, so this is down to the audience to get involved. We have a poll. So the poll is, what are your main challenges with international payroll? So is it paying into exotics, international tax authorities, local legislations, unexpected fees, missing delayed payments? So I'm just going to launch this now. We'll just give you a minute or so just to answer. And if you do have any questions, people are being a bit shy on some of the questions, then please feel free to ask away while we've got the panel here. So what do you guys think is going to be the top one out of this?
I'm looking at some of the challenges our clients have identified to us, and some of the pain points that they've highlighted is around the missing delayed payments. I'm not sure if that's going to be consistent with the audience, but that's certainly a pain that we see all the time, Kelly, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So we got 48% has voted. So come on, the rest of you.
I would probably say the local rules and regulations, I think, are going to be really, really important as well from an employment perspective. One thing that we typically find is that we're used to our country nuances, and so we try to apply those country nuances to the other countries that we're processing those payments into. And I think from our perspective, it's the education component and making sure that our clients understand the rules and regulations of the local country.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm just going to leave it for 20 seconds. So we've had 61%. I'd like to try and get up to 70% if possible. That's my target. So those of you that haven't, it's just one click.
And what was the prize again, Mel? Remind me.
A free ticket to the GPA Awards. There you go. There you go. Got a couple more then. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to leave it now. So we're going to end the poll. And I'm going to share the results with you. Can you all see the results? Fab. Okay. So as you can see, local legislations 38%, and then missing delayed payments 26%. So is there anything that is unexpected or expected from that result?
I think we did well, Rick, didn't we?
Yeah, I was looking for my prize.
You couldn't enter, Rick. Sorry. You should be there anyway. Okay, so we've had a couple of questions. So you're right to answer a couple of questions before we carry on. I don't know if this is who can actually answer this. How is payroll impacted by new fintech apps?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to understand, what apps exactly are we talking about? But if we are talking about kind of the Revolut model, I think, in terms of new fintechs, new wallets. So some of the Amazon Wallet, etc. So a lot of the big organizations, I think it will become where people want to be paid directly into where they distribute their funds or where they spend their money. And I think eventually, there is a model out there where people are going to seek to get more value for their money. And I think there's different technologies that are out there which will allow people point their payroll at. For example, where if it could move into ad tech where people are utilizing people's source of funds to offer more value than the actual dollar amount that they're getting paid. And I think, a lot of fintech or different companies will go down that road.
Okay, thanks, Rory. Okay, so we've looked at external and internal challenges to international payroll. So let's round off our discussion today on a positive and look at some of the alternative approaches. So Kelly, what should a company with staff across the globe look for when considering a payroll payments provider or partner?
Yeah, absolutely, Mel. Well, TransferMate has operated and supported clients in this space for several years. Therefore, some of the considerations that we know, and as Rick and Rory have mentioned, is that you need to have a partner that understands the challenges of global payroll. Look for a provider with the widest reach locally, leverage and expertise in local jurisdictions directly or indirectly through a partner. Someone that will make it easy for you to open new markets and look after payroll related issues locally. So our clients have chosen us because we choose to partner with tier 1 banks who offer us specialized insights into the nuances which are inherent in each local payment environment. So what I'd say then as well is, and Rory touched off this, but look for a partner that will provide validation tools to return responses on the account format during beneficiary creation. So that will allow you to correct any missing information at first point of data entry and will promote future successful transfers. So that's something that we provide, and our clients have found it really useful, is the validation tool as well that comes with our service.
Thanks, Kelly. So Rory, I feel like we've talked about technology quite a lot through this webinar. It seems to be, obviously it's the future, but so can technology help in linking payroll and payments, like time, reporting, accuracy, etc.?
Yeah, it's critical, I think. I won't go into too details like the technologies, but I think modern technologies, the fastest, most agile technologies around Node.js, where it's completely web services based, where multiple systems are joined. And one of the biggest challenges you have is if the same data resides in multiple systems that aren't joined up together, so you don't get accurate reporting, and the data integrity as to what you're trying to manage in payroll gets corrupted. So having systems that are live integrations through web services will allow you to, first and foremost, give you much more speed in the process, but it will become much more accurate because the data that you're inputting into the process is going to be much better, and it's going to be much more transparent and ultimately much safer and compliant. So I would say, in terms of globalization of payroll, like, technology is the biggest enabler for it.
We've been talking about robotics quite a lot. Do you think, especially within the payroll field, will that have any will that affect the payments and payroll side?
Yeah, it certainly would. AI, robotics, there's a lot of terms around it. Like, what does it mean for payroll, I suppose? Ultimately, I think there was a question for Chris there, can you simplify payroll? Ultimately, if I was to simplify it, I would narrow it down. Payroll is a really, really binary. It's one of the most binary aspects of HR. It's either right or wrong. And the first step is the most important. So data, how you input data and how you validate data on the input side of the process is really, really crucial. So automated tools for validation, so AI, understanding variance reporting, understanding, being able to pick out this concepts or things that don't look right is really critical. And technology, when you get into scale, is really the only thing that can do that efficiently. And so I would say definitely AI is going to be a big part on the validation side of payroll, and that ultimately has a knock-on impact to payments.
Okay. So Kelly, what advice would you give to a head office with multiple entities across the globe?
Yeah, we'd have a number of clients that have single head office but have multiple entities across the globe. My advice would be that a lot of these companies tend to hold local bank accounts where they have a presence themselves, but sometimes this can cause trouble too, because a lot of these companies would be publicly listed companies, and for companies like that to have international bank accounts out there is a big risk. Managing these bank accounts to ensure that there's no leakage or fraud can be a huge problem. In addition to that, auditors need to be hired yearly to go through all of the transactions in each of these accounts, validating that the transfers are correct. And this can make it really, really expensive. So I think it's on average, it can cost anywhere up to 20,000 per bank account just to have an auditor audit those. So what I'd recommend is just to look for a provider that has the access to global payment rails, and this will avoid you having the risk of having bank accounts out there that could essentially be manipulated or hacked. Not to mention as well, it also saves a massive amount of time and money for companies to streamline this process. So our clients have found great success in using our entity management system online, as it's a more cohesive ecosystem. So to manage a wider group of entities, you're able to do it through one online account. And what I would say as well is my team would be delighted to share the details with anyone after the webinar on how we're currently supporting our clients in this space and how we're removing the complexities of global payroll across the globe.
So people can contact you directly and you can run a demo with them after today.
Yeah.
Fab. Thanks so much, Kelly. Right, okay, so we're on to questions. We have a few. So panelists, if you can have a look as well, I will be answering them. There's one in particular for Rick. Can you just let everyone know maybe the top 5 exotic countries or currencies that you need to look at or be aware of?
Sure. Luckily, I had my coffee today. So it would be the Brazilian real, Argentinian peso. I would look at the Saudi Arabian, the Saudi currency. I can't think of off the top of my head what it's called. I would look at, right now, there's some fluctuation right now in South Korea with their currency. China is another one right now, a lot more because of what's going on with COVID. And if I was to give a 5th one that I would probably look out for, I would look at the Nigerian currency as well. Those are probably the top 5. And the Saudi Riyal is what it's called.
And Rory, on your side, do you have any countries that have alarm bells for you?
Yeah, no, certainly some of the ones that Rick mentioned there send a shiver up. Brazil, the complexities of Brazil, of getting funds into Brazil, is really, really challenging. So unless you understand the local environment from a payments perspective, it can be very challenging. A number of the African countries have challenges. They can almost differ on a month-to-month basis. I would say what you need to be aware of in some of these jurisdictions, I think that Rich touched on earlier on, is the banking systems in those countries aren't as stable as we may think in some of our countries here. So the proficiency in which people move banks is so much more. So you could have up to 20% of change in bank files every month. So it's more kind of how you manage the process as opposed to the individual currencies themselves.
So one of the questions we had, obviously the poll highlighted about legislation globally or regulations locally. So how do people keep on top of that? Is it with, you know, people like yourselves, your payroll provider, your payments provider, sort of having a, I know you've obviously got Google, but that'll take you forever, wouldn't it, to find stuff out? So is it best to contact people like yourselves to keep on top of it?
It is indeed. It is indeed, Mel. I think for us, the value of bringing in a partner that takes away the complexities, that makes it a little bit more simple, is where the real value add comes. I think if a company needs and wants to pay staff across the globe, they need to have that local expertise, and it's very difficult to obtain that if they don't have those fully functioning revenue generating entities in region. So a partner really is the best and the quickest way for them to become experts in the local markets whilst retaining that global control in one headquarters.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I think Sarah's spot on there in understanding the payments. I think it's also critical, and maybe I'm being biased here, but I think the payroll perspective of it is really important. So, what is the payroll legislative impact on where you're trying to pay into? So, I think getting an understanding from whoever is providing your payroll, be it from a global perspective or a local perspective, the knock-on impact as to how that can impact how you make the payment is really important to understand.
So one thing that we're talking a lot about payroll as well, but remember we do have a number of people who process independent contractors as well, and that's considered a payment process. And I think that's important to understand. And sometimes from an employer perspective or the relationship we have with independent contractors, looking at partners that are going to make sure you stay compliant. If you don't have those entities in those countries, remember how you send those payments. If it's a VAT tax requirement, if it's being held because the bank says, well, you're not an employer, you don't have an entity in this country, how are you paying this employee? It's important that you really understand those rules and regulations, and a partner like TransferMate, like Elements, like Amidas, from the EOR perspective can also probably provide you guys some support and understanding of what you can and cannot do, not just from an employee perspective, but what we use as independent contractors as well.
Thanks, Rick. So we have a question here. Due to the current COVID situation, we cannot have our new hires travel, and we'll need them to work remotely from where they are based. How does this affect us as an employer in terms of local legislation and paying them into their local bank accounts? Currently, we have hires from London, Lebanon, France, to name a few countries.
If I can ask, go ahead, Robert.
I can see a multitude of challenges there. You're really getting into personal, or you're really getting into global mobility tax there, and it's to residency legislation around how long is the individual going to be employed, like technically living in that country. So it's a big question, and you need to answer it from a multitude of different angles. Like, so how long do they plan to be staying in that country? How is that taxable? How is it going to be treated? What's the residency rules? What's the residency rules in the country where their contract is actually based in? And I don't think that the world is ready for that question yet, because we deal with a lot of expats, and it's kind of what our background was before we went into the payroll. It's highly complex at the best of times, but now when it's unplanned, it's even more so. So, not to try and push the question, but there's a lot to think about in it, and it's really jurisdictional dependent as to where there's treaties involved, cross jurisdictional treaties. What's the withholding obligations? Are they through payroll? Or are they through tax return?
And I think
I'm more than happy to provide an answer, but in more depth, what you'd really want to understand the detail behind it.
So maybe it's one like off the webinar. I think we've actually come across similar questions. So I think this is actually maybe a new norm, and more people are struggling with a similar situation, unfortunately.
And Mel, I'd like to add to that as well, is that, again, with this travel, there are certain countries that do allow exemptions based on the time of the employees are no longer in that country. So from the US, if you're out of the country for a certain amount of time, you become exempt from certain taxes up to a certain amount. With COVID, you may be in the US and you may be stuck there, which means you may lose your exemption. So how the payroll's initially set up, if it was claiming a higher or lower withholding tax, or if it was claiming exempt altogether, how that impacts the employee overall and what that's going to look like at the end of the year when they file their taxes. I think that's also important to really talk about, and how you can, work with a partner to help mitigate some of that. But as Rory said, right now, a lot of countries haven't even thought about that because everyone's trying to be safe, but not realizing that how this is going to impact someone's exemption because they travel for work for most of the time.
We have one more question. Hopefully we've got time. We've got 3 minutes. So what if a country does not let payroll payments issued from foreign account, but only from a local account? Is it always necessary to have a local legal entity in such a country to open a bank account, or is there an alternative?
So just as an example, Brazil, you need to actually pay directly into the person's payroll account. What works for us is we partner with a bank who, what they'll do in advance is they'll contact the beneficiaries directly to pre-approve them. And basically, we just advise our clients to let their employees know in advance that our partner will be contacting them directly to pre-approve them. And then because this is a payroll payment, it's easier to get that payment in, and we just settle it locally from our partner bank. So that's something that works for us at the moment. So I suppose it's looking again for a provider that has access, or that's partnered with a bank that will settle that locally for you and do that pre-screening to pre-approve the beneficiaries. Once they're approved once, it makes it a lot easier then for future payroll.
Brilliant.
Just to add to that, like it is varied. Like there is different jurisdictions where it needs to be paid from a local bank, but your payroll partner can sometimes do that on your behalf, where they hold a local bank account. So if it's a trust account held by the payroll partner or the payments partner, I know Rick would probably do a lot of this, they can do that on your behalf and become that kind of employer or that entity for you.
Rory, I was going to say the same thing, and thank you for that. The employer, if you don't have an entity as well, from an EOR perspective, we can partner from that perspective and be the employer of record on your behalf, and then process the payments for the employees in that particular country. The one question I had, though, Kelly, and if you don't mind volleying the question to you, if the client does not have a legal entity in that country, so then you would process that payment as a contractor then to that person, or how would you, from a TransferMate perspective, how are you processing that as a payroll payment? Just to maybe I can understand that a little bit more.
Yeah, so basically the payroll client would know the beneficiary and know that it's a payroll payment already. So our banking partner will contact the beneficiaries directly to pre-approve them. And because that's considered less risky in local jurisdictions, and they can control the FX exchange onshore, it makes it easier, or this is a perfect solution for payroll type clients to get payments in this way. I hope that answers your question, Rick.
It does. Kelly, we know each other very well. That's probably going to trigger 20 more questions, but we can take that offline.
Okay.
So I just want to say thank you so much to TransferMate, to Kelly and Sarah. Thank you, Rory and Rick, Amedis and the Elements. Thank you so much. It was such an interesting panel. Really enjoyed it. There are a couple of questions that we weren't able to answer, but we'll come back to you on that. If people do want to contact you after the webinar, best place through LinkedIn, link in with you all?
Yeah, happy to do so.
Absolutely.
Fab. Okay. As I said, the slides and the recording will be available on our website. We will also send it out. You can contact also TransferMate. They'll have a copy of it. If you have any questions, feel free to email me and I can send them to the panel. So all I have to say is thank you, guys, and look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar. Thanks.
Thanks, Mel. Take care.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Mel.
All right.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.